My name's Roxanne Gibson. I'm the Senior HR Advisor in iTeam. The webinar I'm going to be presenting today is all about how we simplify performance management. So just to let you know that we had roughly 170 registrants, which is great, and there will be a recorded version of the webinar available after this session. Also, we'd love to hear from you. So if you've got any ideas about future webinars, then please do let us know. So before we go into what the main session today, just a little bit about the webinar system itself. So you'll see that there is a Q&A tab as well as a chat tab. So please feel free to add your questions as we go along, and I'll try my best to answer them as we go. Or if I don't get the opportunity to answer them as we go, then I will answer them at the end of the session. I'm also going to be asking you some poll questions as well. So next to the chat function, you'll see that there's a Q&A, and there I'll be asking you some poll questions. So when I mention that, if you just click on that poll tab, it will give you the opportunity to answer those questions that I'm asking you. So talking of poll questions, let's do one of those just to kick us off. So you have to bear with me because you'll see that I'm going from two screens. So I want you to know that I'm not ignoring you. I'm just going between the two screens, and I'm in charge of all the technical things today. So yes, we'll see what happens there. But first, poll question. I'm going to start that one now. So if you go into your Q&A tab, then you should see that there's a question in there that I'd like you to answer if possible, please, just to get a better understanding of who the audience is. So we've got responses coming in. Thank you. So yeah, so it's a real good mix of NHS and private treatment practices, and private and NHS only. So a real good mix there. You can carry on answer that question if you haven't done so already. I'm just going to, before we go into the main presentation, I just want to just do one more poll question if I can. So you should now see another question come up in your Q&A tab. If you could just have a look at answering that one for me as well, please. That's great. We've got responses coming in. And it's a real good mix again. Yeah, that's fantastic. So yeah, so we have got some smaller practices, and then we've got some in the middle, and then some larger ones as well in terms of number of employees. So that's brilliant. Thank you. That's just so we can get an understanding of who's engaging in these things. So that's perfect. Thank you so much. Right, let's get started. So here is the agenda for today's session. So what I want you to get out of the session, so the aim of this session is for you to improve understanding of the benefits of a thorough performance management process, to help you avoid potentially costly mistakes when dismissing employees, and to cover the difference in approach for employees who have employment rights and those who don't, and to highlight the risk of not carrying out a thorough performance management process. So the agenda that we've got here today should cover all of those things so that you're able to take those things away from that session. So moving on to the next slide then, what is performance management? So I know that this isn't going to be new to you. You've been running practices, doing business for a long time. So this isn't me trying to tell you what you already know. It's just I think when you think about performance management, it isn't just one single activity. So performance management aims to monitor, maintain and improve employee performance in line with the organisation's objectives. It's not a single activity, but it's rather a group of activities that should be approached holistically. So it's not a single activity, but a number of different activities. There's lots of, if you haven't seen it already, there is lots of resources in iComply that can help with the holistic approach to performance management. And at the end of this session on the slides, there's a list of documents that you might find useful with all of the iComply codes as well. And it covers things like appraisals and all the documents that go alongside that. So So yes, as I said, it's not just one activity, it's lots of different activities, and it could be things like talent management. So talent management is an exercise that identifies your top talent, and allows you to put in plans place to keep those individuals engaged and motivated. So for example, if you've got somebody, that's one of your top performers, and you want to look at how you can keep them motivated and keep them engaged, keep them in the practice, you could look at potentially enrolling them in some additional training programs. Talent management also allows you to identify any skills gaps. So if you kind of have a look at the talent matrix, and you can see that actually, we have got a real gap in skills here. And if this person was to leave, or if this person goes on annual leave, or is just away from the business, then actually it puts us at risk. So by doing talent management, you can help identify those gaps and close those gaps down, as well as for succession planning for the future as well. Another good tool for performance management seems straightforward, but one-to-ones are really, are really important. Best practice advice would be to try and do those monthly. And I know that sometimes it felt like you haven't got the capacity to do that, but in the long run, it is really worthwhile doing that. Within the one-to-ones, we'd expect conversations to be happening around productivity, reviewing their behaviour and attitude, reviewing targets that you've set them, putting performance improvement plans in place if those said targets aren't being achieved. So those are the type of things that you talk about in one-to-ones. And then you've got the appraisal. So this should be an annual exercise, and it's really important because CQC inspector will be looking out for this when they're completing their inspection. So it's really vital that you do complete your appraisals annually and you keep records of that. And then usually in line with appraisals, if you're going to do any salary reviews or performance related bonuses, then that would usually be in line with appraisals and, their overall performance in their appraisal rating. So moving on to the next slide, why should I do performance management? So here at Agilio, we do believe that prevention is better than cure. So, what we mean by that is if you're engaging in those activities that I've just spoken about on the previous slide, then you should be able to manage somebody's performance. And ideally, if somebody isn't performing to the level that you need them to perform, by doing all of those activities, providing additional support and training, then you could usually turn that person's performance around. But ultimately, we need to accept that there will come a time that you've done everything that you can, and a different course of action needs to be taken now. So unfortunately, when dealing with people, this is always going to be the case, and this is always going to be an area that requires attention. So when you're doing your regular one-to-ones and you're feeding back on overall performance, you've put performance plans in place, but the individual still isn't performing to the level that you need them to perform, you now need to look at taking more formal action. So one of the things that's come up a lot recently, and I know it's a challenge that all practices are struggling with, is that you recruit an individual that it's been a tough process to recruit people, especially nurses at the moment. So if that person that you've recruited maybe isn't performing as you need them to perform, it might seem easier to keep them in role because it took you such a long time to get them, to recruit them. But in the long run, it really just isn't worth it. So it is best to try and nip that in the bud, as early as possible. So on this slide here, you can see the benefits of performance management. If you've got an individual that is engaged and motivated, you're more likely to retain that person. They're not going to leave. Somebody's going to be more happier. There's going to be increased morale. You're going to get more from that individual, higher productivity, overall leading to, all of those things will contribute to a well-led practice. You can see that I've highlighted two of those benefits on there because I think those two are really important for us to discuss. And I'm just going to move on to the next slide where I'll talk a little bit more about why I've highlighted those. So on this slide here, this is what happens if an employee's performance is not reviewed and managed. So you'll see that it's kind of a reverse from the previous slide. So if you're not doing those things, you are going to see a drop in morale, potentially increased absence. You're going to potentially, see your processes that are failing, the patient care is not up to standard. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, the ones that I've highlighted is around poor patient experience and CQC failures. So ultimately, if a CQC inspection highlighted performance concerns for an employee, especially if this employee is a GDC registered employee, and it came to light as part of the inspection that the practice was aware of the concerns, then this could negatively affect the outcome of the inspection, as you'd expect. So the inspector would also look for, for evidence of what you're doing to, to turn that, to try and turn that performance around. I've also highlighted patient experience as well. I mean, I kind of guess it does speak for itself, but if patients don't feel that they're receiving the level of care that they expect, and it's not up to their standards, then they will, of course, seek to find a new practice that does meet their expectations. And without patients, ultimately, there isn't any business there. So that is very important. Okay. So we're now moving on to, we've done all the bits around, I've tried to support this individual, but they're not doing what we need them to do. So we've now made the decision that, okay, we are going to move to dismissal. So I am going to go through the dismissal process for somebody who has more than 2 years service, and for somebody who has less than 2 years service, because there is a different process for those. And kind of putting the caveat out there now that there is a lot of information to take on board, but the whole whole premise around this webinar was for us to try and simplify it for you. So although I will be sharing a lot of information on this slide particularly, when I move on to the next few slides, I've tried to break it down into a simplified flow chart, so that if you're in a situation where you're managing an employee, it should be as simple for you to pick it up and say, okay, I'm at this step in the process. Where do I go from there? So you've made the decision to dismiss. Before moving to dismissal, I would ask you to consider, so if you were to call me up and ask for advice, I'd ask you to consider if the employee has any protected characteristics or any disabilities where they could claim for unlawful discrimination. So those are the things that we need to consider. If the answer is no, so if from talking to the employee they've never disclosed anything that that you should be aware of in terms of any disability or any protected characteristics, and this is if they haven't told you. You don't know what you don't know. So this is about the information that they've shared with you. The process is pretty straightforward here, in that you would invite to a performance review meeting. There's templates in iComply that you can use for this. And within that invitation, it states that the outcome could be dismissal. So if that's the route that you're going down, it needs to be clear in the invite letter that it could be a potential outcome. So you need to put that within the letter. And in this scenario, as the employment is under 2 years, the employer does not necessarily need to justify the decision to dismiss or even follow a fair procedure. But we do advise that you do the above as a minimum in terms of inviting them to the meeting, setting the expectations that the outcome could be dismissal. Also in this scenario, we don't have any discrimination concerns. So therefore, we've had the meeting, we've dismissed the employee who has less than 2 years service, and this is called short-term dismissal. When you've followed this process, you then need to put the decision in writing. Again, your templates are in iComply for this, or we can help you draft it. That's not a problem at all. So that's pretty straightforward, that one. There's no concerns there. The risk is minimal to the business, pretty straightforward. So what if the employee does have a disability that impacts on their ability to perform the role? So if the answer to that is yes, they do have a disability, I've got concerns that there might be a disability there. Before you can dismiss, you would need to demonstrate that you have considered and made reasonable adjustments to support this person. So an example of this, if you had somebody on the team who had a mental health disorder, you could, a reasonable adjustment might be reviewing their workload, seeing if there's anything that can be passed on to other team members, or maybe reviewing and amending their working hours to support them. If after you've made those adjustments and you've put the additional support in place, you then didn't see an improvement, you could then move to dismissal. The key thing that we will be looking for here, and if anybody was to, to put you in front of a tribunal, you would need to be able to demonstrate to the tribunal that you've acknowledged that there was a disability and you attempted to support that person before moving to dismissal by making reasonable adjustments. But after those reasonable adjustments, you saw no improvement and you were left with no other option but to dismiss. It would be very difficult for a tribunal to prove discrimination with, evidence that backs up what you've tried to do to support that person. Just to give you a bit of an example as to where an employee could claim discrimination, it's very extreme, and I don't expect anybody would would do this or come across it. But it's just to give you a bit of an example around where you wouldn't follow the short-term dismissal process. So you may have a pregnant employee who maybe is always forgetting to do a particular task or a process. But when speaking to this pregnant person, they claim that it's due to extreme fatigue and tiredness and sickness that's associated with the pregnancy. That's the reason. That's what's affecting their ability to perform. So if you were to move to short-term dismissal without considering an alternative, you are putting yourselves at risk there of a discrimination claim at tribunal. So it will be difficult to defend that one. So in that scenario, you would look at, what reasonable adjustments could I do to support that person? That was a very extreme example. And, anybody that joined the last webinar when we talked about pregnant employees, goes without saying that you kind of need to tread very carefully. So if you've got any in that situation, do just get in touch with us and we can help you navigate that. So if there were any concerns or red flags with a potential discrimination, you would need to revert to the extended process, so which we'll discuss next. So before we move on to that, I think it's worth mentioning that although employees with less than 2 years service cannot bring a claim for unfair dismissal, they can bring a claim for automatic unfair dismissal, which I know sounds the same thing, but it's not. This is when dismissal is inherently unfair. So an example of this would be an automatic unfair dismissal would be if an employee wanted to execute their right to statutory benefits. So just for example, say that they wanted to take maternity leave and they were refused by their practice. Again, unlikely to happen, but although they can't claim for constructive dismissal, in this scenario, they might be able to claim for automatic unfair dismissal. So that it's just, that is something to be aware of as well. So as I said, lots of information to take in there. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. And this is very much a simplified flow of all of everything that I've just discussed. So if that's not very clear, apologies. What I'll do is I'll try and enhance the quality of that following this, so that when it's available, you can you can actually use this flow chart. So you'll see at the top it says dismissal less than 2 years, and then it flows through to any disabilities or protected characteristics to consider, and then you've got yes or no. So no, it then follows through the process that we spoke about. So you invite to the meeting, you hold the meeting, explain why you're considering dismissal, you adjourn and consider any mitigating factors that they may have put forward in that meeting. You then reconvene, and it can be as much as you adjourn the meeting for kind of 10 minutes. You just need to show that you've considered anything that's come out of that meeting. You reconvene and confirm that the decision is dismissal. You would then confirm that decision in writing, and they don't have an automatic right to appeal, and that would be the end of the process. If somebody did have, if you were, suspected that there was any disabilities or protected characteristics, then you go to yes, and you then flow through. So implement reasonable adjustments. If no improvement after additional support and reasonable adjustments, there should then be an arrow, apologies. You then follow the process there that you have on the right hand side. So you would then go to invite to performance review meeting, and then it flows through the same process as if there wasn't any protected characteristics. So hopefully that just makes it a bit easier to follow, when you're actually dealing with this situation, because I appreciate that was a lot of information to take on board. I'm just going to go into the poll questions just for a second. And just a couple of questions then, if you don't mind, answering those, just to get an idea of the situations that you've dealt with already, just to try and understand the experience. So I will start with this one. So if there should be another question now that's popped up in the Q&A. So if you can have a look at that one, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, responses are coming through. Slightly more people in the no response for the no. So that's interesting. That so hopefully you'll find what we've just covered. You'll find that useful. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to move on. So you can carry on answering that if you haven't done so already, and then I can collect the results at the end. I'm going to move on now to the next slide, which breaks down the process for a dismissal when you have an employee with 2 or more years service. Okay. So actually, whilst you're still in the poll, I will ask you around, so this one is looking at 2 years service. So if I can ask you to answer the question around dismissing an employee with more than 2 years service. So that question should appear on there now. Yeah, that's kind of what I expected. It's definitely more tricky when somebody's got 2 or more years service, and the majority of you have said that you haven't had to dismiss an employee with more than 2 years service. So yeah, definitely more tricky, but hopefully this will help you navigate it a bit easier and see that there is a process that can be followed, and if somebody really just isn't right to be in the business, then there is a way that you can legitimately dismiss that person without putting the practice of the business at risk. So I appreciate you doing that. Thank you very much. So dismissal with more than 2 years service. So these are the employees that as soon as they get 2 years service, they gain full employment rights, and they could bring a claim for constructive or unfair dismissal. If they feel that a breach of contract has occurred, or they feel that they have no choice to resign because of something that their employer has done, that's how they could look at bringing about a tribunal claim for constructive or unfair dismissal. So the main difference in the process when an employee has more than 2 years service is that you need to be able to demonstrate that you followed a fair process and you've got a justified reason for dismissing. So you can demonstrate this by following the disciplinary process that's in the handbook. You should all I-team members should have the handbook. If for any reason you haven't, then please get in touch with us. We can help you with that. But if you're following the disciplinary process in the handbook, then you can't go far wrong. It's really important that you keep copies of performance improvement plans, competency records. It's really important to ensure that you've got robust competence records and documentation, because if you are put in front of you end up in a tribunal situation, you will need to be able to demonstrate that what have you done to help this person to improve their performance, and you'd need that really strong audit trail to defend the case. So one of the I'm just going to move on because I just want to I'll come back to these ones in a minute. One of the good things about I-team is that it allows you to, it has has the function to save individual files into employee personnel files. So it allows you to keep documents, of all conversations, any meetings, anything that's taken place. You can upload that within the iTeam application, and it allows you then to keep a record of that, and you can use that as your employee personnel file. So that those of you who use iTeam will be familiar with that screen there. I'm just going to go back to where we were. Okay. So if you're following the disciplinary process in the handbook, typically in misconduct cases, the formal disciplinary process will involve providing the employee with a series of warnings and opportunities for them to improve their performance before considering dismissal. So unlike a straightforward dismissal, short-term dismissal, where they've got less than 2 years service, there's no red flags in terms of any discrimination or protected characteristics. You can move through the process quite quickly. It isn't necessarily the case with somebody who's got more than 2 years service. So typically it can take between 6 and 12 months to go through the process, because you are following the process, you're issuing a series of warnings. But if you're not seeing that improvement, you need to just stick with the process. And yes, it will feel like you're kind of having another meeting, and then they're not performing, and then you have another meeting. But by doing that and following that process, you are moving it, and you're getting closer to that endpoint, to then be able to, if you need to, dismiss that person legitimately, and then still be able to demonstrate to anybody or to a tribunal that you have followed a robust and a fair process. So you've done all of that. You've gone through the process. You've issued the series of warnings. There's no improvement. You've exhausted all options, but you feel that you're left with no other alternative to dismiss. You do need to consider an alternative to dismissal, whether that could be looking at, including demotion, so giving them a role with lesser responsibilities, removal of certain duties, changing a location if you've got multiple site practice. So if you've considered all of those things and you can't do it, then you're moving to dismissal. And when you're doing the final termination meeting, ideally, again, this isn't going to be as easy for the smaller practices, but if you've got, it would be good if you could get an independent person to hold the meeting. So for example, if the line manager of the team member was holding some of the initial meetings, it would make better sense for either the practice manager or the practice owner to hold the dismissal meeting, because it just increases impartiality. So I know that's not always going to be possible, but that's the advice that that's what the best practice would be. So when you terminate employees, it's really important to ensure that you give them their entitlement to their contractual notice period. So usually what we would recommend is that you pay them their notice in lieu, and don't ask them to work during their notice period, because it's not going to be a pleasant environment for anybody who is being dismissed and then expect them to work their notice period. And I think, given the fact that you're dismissing them, there's going to be issues with that person's performance, and it's just far easier and better overall for employees and patients if that person just isn't in the business. So you'd usually just pay them in lieu of notice. And as with all other stages of the disciplinary process as set out in the handbook, you should provide the team member with a letter confirming outlining the meeting and giving the full reasons for the decision. And this is normally to be sent straight away without any delay. So the flow on this slide takes you through that process that I've just spoke about. So I think, again, there was a lot of information to take in, but hopefully this flow chart breaks it down. Moving on to the next slide, the difference again for an employee who has gained employment rights because they've got two or more years service is that they have you have to give them the opportunity to appeal. So this slide here just breaks it down. So you give them the opportunity to appeal. You either receive an appeal or you don't. Well, there's no appeal. If there's no appeal, that's the end of the process. Pretty straightforward. If you do get an appeal, then there is a flow process to go through there. So again, where possible, an independent person should hear the appeal. You then consider the reasons for the appeal and whether you then upheld the appeal or not. And then I think if you do find yourself in this situation, although this flow is useful to use, then I think, please just give us a call. We're more than happy to help with that, because I think this is when it gets a bit more tricky. So this is very much around somebody's performance and conduct. So if you're finding that you've got issues with an employee's sickness or capability and they've got more than 2 years service, then it is a slightly different process to follow. So if you're currently finding yourself in this situation, or you find yourself in this situation in the future, then we would just ask that you get in touch with one of the HR team to discuss that. Okay, so we've now covered the main points then that I wanted to cover for dismissal for less than 2 years and for approaching dismissal for somebody who has more than 2 years service. I just want to, so this slide is here just covering the key actions and takeaway points. So I think I just wanted to just cover the pitfalls for less than 2 years, just so a bit of a recap. So just a reminder then, so although an employee with less than 2 years service cannot bring about a claim for unfair dismissal, they might be able to make a claim for unlawful discrimination, which I talked about previously. That's where, if there was any disabilities and they felt that we didn't consider those and we dismissed because of that, then that's where they could bring an unlawful discrimination claim to a tribunal. The other thing that you need to be aware of somebody who has less than 2 years service is that they could make a claim for automatic unfair dismissal, which is where a dismissal is inherently unfair. And the example I used was around an employee executing their right to a statutory benefit like maternity and being refused. Again, very unlikely to happen. It's just, something to be aware of. And then pitfalls or things to be aware of when an employee has more than 2 years service, where they gain in full employment rights and they can claim constructive dismissal or unfair dismissal if they felt necessary. We need to be able to demonstrate, or you need to be able to demonstrate as an employer, that you followed a fair process and you had a justified reason for dismissing them. And the way that you demonstrate that is by following disciplinary process in the handbook, keeping copies of all performance improvement plans, records of meetings, so that if you did end up in a tribunal situation and you had to defend the case, you've got a really strong audit trail, including these documents that would support you, which you can upload and keep in IT. So just to recap again, I know I just mentioned it, but so if you've got anybody who's got sickness concerns, multiple absences, slightly different than the process flows we just spoke about. So please do get in touch if you've got any of those cases. And then I've just put on there, so are you ready? So a couple of things to think about. So, if you really want to think, actually, right, that's it. Now it's time for us to really get on top of our performance management. If you do look to implement it now, it just makes, if you do have somebody who's not performing, it just makes it so much easier to be able to manage that person. And actually, it makes things easier, like the appraisals process. If you're having regular performance reviews, when it comes to the annual appraisal, all of the things in there that you've been discussing, none of it's going to be a surprise, and it should just be a recap of conversations that you've had throughout the year. So if you are looking at really getting stuck into your performance management, those are just some of the things that you can have a look at in iComply. Some of the documents there around the capability procedure, the appraisals overview. There's appraisals forms in there that you can use. Maybe think about trying to plan in some one-to-ones if you don't have those in. And then maybe, you already do your annual appraisals. Just if you get opportunity, review those appraisals and see if there's any outstanding actions from previous appraisals, so that your employees feel that you care enough to be able to go back and review to see if there is any actions, but also, if it was to be picked up in any CQC inspection, that it shows that you are you are taking appropriate actions. So this is the final slide. So this is just a few of the documents that you can find in iComply that will help you support you through the process of performance management. So so those are some of the documents that you might find helpful. But otherwise, that does now conclude our session. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for your time. Goodbye.